The wind hit Anders Lindqvist's cabin with enough force to crack timber, and across the settlement he could hear the sound of logs splitting in the cold. But inside his willow-weave walls, the structure flexed like a living thing, bending with the storm's rage before settling back into place, warm and intact, while his neighbors huddled against the deadly gaps opening in their solid log homes. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible to believe. The gap appeared in the northeast corner of the cabin on the 9th night of January in 1846. Anders Lindqvist woke to the sound his wife Elisabeth made when she was trying not to wake him, a quiet gasping that meant she was cold beyond the point where blankets helped. He reached for her in the darkness and found her shaking beneath 3 layers of wool and fur. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped enough that he could see his breath in the dim glow from the banked coals in the fireplace. Something was wrong. The cabin had been warm when they went to sleep. He rose and moved toward the fireplace, thinking the fire had died more than it should have, but the coals were still giving off heat. The cold was coming from somewhere else. He took a candle from the mantel and lit it from the coals, then moved slowly around the perimeter of the single-room cabin they had built 3 years earlier when they first arrived in the Minnesota Territory. The light caught something in the corner, a line of darkness that should not have been there. Anders knelt and held the candle close. The gap was perhaps a 1/4 inch wide, running vertically where 2 logs met at the corner joint. The notching had shifted. He could feel cold air pouring through the opening like water from a creek. Outside, the temperature was perhaps 30 degrees below zero. Inside, that stream of air was lowering the cabin's temperature with deadly efficiency. He stuffed a wool shirt into the gap as a temporary measure, then added more wood to the fire and returned to bed. Elisabeth had stopped shaking, but when he touched her face, her skin was cold in a way that frightened him. He pulled her close, trying to share what warmth his body held, and waited for morning. The dawn came late and gray. Anders rose and checked the gap. The shirt he had stuffed into it was frozen solid, coated in a layer of ice from the moisture in the cabin's air meeting the outside cold. He removed it and examined the corner more carefully in daylight. The problem was obvious now. The logs had contracted in the extreme cold. Wood shrank when temperatures dropped, and the notched corner joint had compressed unevenly, creating a gap that grew wider as the logs continued to contract. He could fix it temporarily by repacking the chinking or driving wooden wedges into the gap. But even as he considered these solutions, he understood they addressed the symptom, not the cause. The fundamental problem was the nature of log construction itself. Logs were rigid. They expanded and contracted with temperature and moisture changes. The notched corners relied on weight and friction. When logs moved, joints shifted, gaps appeared. It was not a flaw in his construction, but a flaw in the method itself. He turned to check on Elisabeth. She was still in bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her breathing was shallow, and her lips had taken on a blue tint. He built up the fire until it roared, but the damage was done. Elisabeth died 3 hours after sunrise. Anders buried her 2 days later on a hillside above the settlement when the ground thawed enough to dig. Anders returned to the cabin after burying Elisabeth and sat in the silence for 3 days. He did not trap. He did not visit neighbors who came to offer condolences. He sat at the table and stared at the corner where the gap had appeared. Other men would have accepted what happened as tragedy, as the cost of frontier life, as God's will, or simple bad luck. Anders could not let it go. He began examining every aspect of the cabin's construction with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He studied the corners first, understanding now what he had not seen when he built the structure. The saddle notch joints were elegant in their simplicity. Each log was notched on the bottom to fit over the log below, creating an interlocking pattern that required no fasteners. The weight of upper logs compressed lower ones, and friction held everything in place. It was a method that had worked for centuries in Sweden, but adequately was not the same as reliably. Anders traced the corner joints with his fingers, feeling how the notches had compressed. He measured the gaps with small wood chips, noting that different corners had shifted by different amounts. Corners on the north and east sides, exposed to prevailing winter winds, had compressed more than corners on the south and west. The logs themselves had contracted more on their exposed faces than on their interior faces, creating a twisting stress that the notches could not accommodate. He moved to the chinking between logs. When he had built the cabin, he had used the standard method, packing moss and mud mixture into the gaps. The chinking had worked well for 2 years. Now he could see its failure. The mud had dried and cracked in dozens of places. The moss had compressed, creating voids. Some sections had fallen out entirely, where rain and wind had eroded them. He could repair all of this. He could repack every gap, reshape every notch, drive wedges to tighten joints, but he would be repairing a system that was fundamentally flawed. Rigid logs moving against rigid joints with compressible material filling the inevitable gaps, it would fail again. The realization that obsessed him was simple but profound. The method everyone used, the method that had been proven over generations, had a fatal weakness. Rigid materials could not accommodate movement, compression joints could not prevent shifting, and gaps, once they appeared, allowed cold that killed. Anders spent his evenings that week visiting other cabins in the settlement. He told people he was checking on them, offering help, being a good neighbor. What he was actually doing was studying how their cabins were built and how they were failing. Every cabin he visited had problems. Some had visible gaps at corners, others had chinking that had fallen out. Several had doors that no longer fit their frames properly because the log walls had settled unevenly. One cabin had a crack running through a wall log itself, split by the stress of uneven contraction. The settlers accepted these problems as normal. They repaired them each spring and fall, packed new chinking, trimmed doors, added wedges. It was simply part of maintaining a log cabin. But Anders saw it differently. He saw a pattern of failure that was not accidental but inherent. He saw that every repair was temporary because the fundamental problem was not poor maintenance, but poor design. Rigid logs would always move with temperature changes. Notched corners would always compress unevenly, and those gaps could kill. On the 8th night after Elizabeth's death, Anders dreamed of his grandmother's hands weaving willow branches into baskets, with movements so fast they blurred. He woke before dawn and lit a candle, and the memory stayed with him, vivid and detailed in a way dreams rarely were. His grandmother had been a basket maker in the village outside Gothenburg, where Anders was born. She had learned the craft from her mother, who had learned it from hers, going back generations. Anders had spent countless hours as a child watching her work, fascinated by how she could take thin willow branches and transform them into containers strong enough to carry stones or water. She had tried to teach him the basics, but his hands had been too clumsy then, more interested in running through fields than sitting still to learn what he considered women's work. Now, sitting in his cold cabin 20 years later and half a world away from that Swedish village, Anders wished desperately that he had paid more attention. He closed his eyes and tried to recall exactly how she had worked. She would start with willow cut in early spring when the sap was rising and the branches were most flexible. The weaving itself was deceptively simple. She would set up vertical stakes driven into a wooden base, then weave horizontal branches between them over one stake, under the next, creating a pattern that locked each branch in place through the pressure of the weave itself. No glue, no nails, no fasteners of any kind, just willow branches held together by their own tension and the intelligence of the pattern. What struck Anders now, thinking about it with a builder's mind rather than a child's wandering attention, was how strong those baskets were. He remembered watching his father load a willow basket with iron tools, weight enough to make a man grunt when lifting, and the basket had held without deforming. He remembered a storm when he was perhaps 8 years old that had knocked over everything in the yard, but his grandmother's baskets had tumbled and rolled and emerged intact, not a single broken branch. They were strong because they were flexible. When stressed, each individual willow branch could bend slightly, and the weave pattern distributed that stress across hundreds of contact points. There was no single point of failure, no rigid joint that could break or gap that could open. The baskets could flex and return to shape because that was the nature of willow and the genius of the weaving pattern. Anders stood and went to the corner where the fatal gap had appeared. He knelt and examined it again in the candlelight, but this time he was not thinking about logs and notches. He was thinking about willow branches woven between vertical posts. He was thinking about walls that could flex instead of crack. He was thinking about a structure that could move with temperature changes instead of fighting them. The idea seemed absurd at first consideration. Baskets were small, portable, temporary things. Cabins were large, permanent, substantial structures. Except that perhaps you could scale up the technique, use thicker branches, weave them tighter. If you built a frame of solid posts to serve as the vertical stakes and wove willow between them horizontally, the more Anders thought about it, the more possible it seemed. Anders waited 2 weeks before mentioning his idea to anyone. He spent those weeks testing small sections of Willow-Weave to understand how the technique would scale. He cut bundles of willow from the creek bottom and experimented with different weaving patterns in a shed behind his cabin. He needed to know if the concept was even possible before subjecting himself to the ridicule he knew was coming. The answer appeared to be yes. Willow branches thick as a man's thumb could be woven tightly enough that light barely passed through. The weave was rigid when complete, but retained flexibility that allowed it to bend without breaking. He tested sections by pressing hard against them, and they flexed inward before springing back to shape. He soaked one section with water and left it outside through a freeze, and unlike chinking that cracked, the willow held its integrity. Satisfied that the idea was feasible, Anders visited Niels Ekstrom, his nearest neighbor, on a cold morning in early February. Niels was splitting firewood when Anders arrived. They spoke briefly about weather before Anders mentioned what he was planning. He explained that he intended to rebuild his cabin using willow branches woven between posts instead of solid logs notched at corners. Niels stopped splitting wood and stared at Anders for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not cruel laughter, but it was not kind either. It was the laughter of a man hearing something so absurd that he assumed it must be a joke. When Anders did not laugh with him, Niels's expression shifted to concern. "You are serious," Niels said. "I am," Anders replied. "You want to build a cabin out of basket weaving?" Niels said slowly, as if testing whether the words sounded more reasonable when spoken aloud. They did not. Niels set down his axe. "Anders, I know you are grieving. Losing Elisabeth was a terrible thing. But this idea is not rational thinking. You cannot build a cabin out of willow branches. Willow is for baskets and fish traps, not for houses. A house needs solid walls, proper logs, notched corners. Log walls crack and develop gaps," Anders said. "So you pack better chinking," Niels said. "You do not abandon proven methods and try to live inside a giant basket." The conversation went nowhere. They parted with Niels promising to help if Anders came to his senses. By the next day, word had spread through the settlement. Anders had apparently lost his mind and was planning to build a cabin out of basket weaving. Henrik Sundquist, who served as the settlement's informal elder, stopped by 3 days later. He was a large man with a gray beard and a commanding voice. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "This willow wall foolishness," Henrik said. "You need to abandon it." Anders explained his reasoning. Henrik listened without interrupting, but when Anders finished, the elder's expression had not changed. "I understand your grief," Henrik said, but you are proposing to waste an entire building season on an experiment that will fail. Your idea might work for a sheep pen, it will not work for a dwelling." Anders ignored Henrik's advice and began preparations in late February when the worst of winter had passed, but the ground remained frozen. He needed willow in quantities no basket maker had ever contemplated. A basket required perhaps 20 or 30 branches. A cabin wall would require thousands. He spent the first week simply walking the creek bottoms within 3 miles of his cabin site, identifying willow stands and evaluating their suitability. Not all willow was equal for his purposes. He needed branches that were straight, flexible, and thick enough to provide structural strength when woven together. The ideal diameter was roughly the thickness of a man's thumb, perhaps slightly larger. Too thin, and the branches would lack strength. Too thick, and they would be difficult to weave tightly. He marked suitable stands by tying strips of cloth to nearby trees, creating a map of harvest locations he could work systematically. The cutting itself was more complex than simply chopping down willow. Anders needed the branches to retain as much flexibility as possible, which meant harvesting at the right time and in the right way. Late winter was ideal because the sap had not yet risen fully, but the extreme cold had passed. The willow was dormant, but not frozen brittle. He used a sharp hatchet and cut each branch as close to the main trunk as possible, leaving clean cuts that would allow the willow to regenerate. His grandmother had taught him that much, at least. Properly harvested willow would grow back, providing future material. He bundled the cut branches in groups of 50, tied with leather strips, and hauled them back to his cabin on a sled he had built for the purpose. The work was exhausting. Each day he would cut and bundle, then haul loads back through snow that was often knee-deep in the creek bottoms. He worked from dawn until his hands were too numb to grip the hatchet, then returned to his cabin to thaw by the fire. The pile of bundled willow grew slowly beside his cabin. Neighbors who passed by on their way to check trap lines or hunt would stop and stare at the growing mound of branches. Some asked what he was doing. Anders told them he was preparing to build. Most shook their heads and continued on their way. A few offered comments that ranged from puzzled to mocking. One trapper named Gustav suggested Anders was planning the world's largest basket. Another asked if he intended to weave a fence around the entire settlement. Anders did not argue or explain. He simply continued cutting and hauling. By mid-March, he had accumulated what he estimated to be roughly 4,000 willow branches, each between 6 and 8 feet long. The pile was taller than a man and nearly as wide as his current cabin. It represented 6 weeks of dawn-to-dusk labor in cold that never rose above freezing. He was not finished cutting, but he had enough to begin the next phase. He needed to process the willow before it dried completely and lost its flexibility. The branches had to be sorted by thickness, stripped of small side shoots, and soaked in water to maintain pliability. Anders dug a shallow trench near the creek and lined it with stones, creating a soaking pool where he could submerge bundles of willow. The water kept the branches flexible and prevented them from becoming brittle as they dried. It was tedious work, but Anders had learned patience through necessity. The foundation work began in early April when the ground thawed enough to dig. Anders had decided to build on the same site where his log cabin stood, but first he had to dismantle the structure that had failed him. He pulled down the logs methodically, salvaging anything useful. The corner logs with their notched joints he set aside. They would serve as firewood, a practical end to a flawed design. The site itself required more preparation than his previous cabin had received. Anders understood now that good construction began below ground, not above it. He dug post holes at 8-foot intervals around the perimeter of his planned cabin, each hole 3 feet deep. The depth was critical. Posts set shallow would shift and settle. Posts set deep would remain stable through freeze and thaw cycles. Into each hole he placed a flat stone at the bottom to prevent the post from sinking into mud during spring thaws. The posts themselves were carefully selected logs, each roughly 10 inches in diameter and straight as he could find. He set them vertically in the holes and packed the earth around them with rocks and tamped soil, creating a solid foundation for each post. The posts extended 8 feet above ground, creating the vertical framework that would hold his woven willow walls. Once the perimeter posts were set, Anders built the roof frame. This was traditional timber construction, and he followed proven methods. Horizontal beams connected the tops of the posts. Ridge poles ran the length of the cabin. Cross beams provided support for the roof itself. The frame was solid, built to carry the weight of a heavy roof and withstand wind stress. Neighbors who watched this phase of construction relaxed slightly. Anders was apparently building a normal cabin after all. The frame looked conventional, properly engineered, nothing unusual about the structure. Their relief was premature. With the frame complete, Anders began the weaving. He started at ground level, taking soaked willow branches from his prepared bundles and weaving them horizontally between the vertical posts. The technique was exactly what his grandmother had used for baskets, but scaled up. Over one post, under the next, over, under, each branch locked into place through the tension of the weave. He worked slowly, ensuring each branch was seated properly before adding the next. The weaving had to be tight. Gaps would defeat the entire purpose. He used a wooden mallet to tap branches into position, compressing each row before starting the next. The work was hard on his hands. The willow branches, even soaked, had rough bark that abraded his palms. By the end of each day, his hands were raw and bleeding in places. He wrapped them in cloth each morning and continued. The progress was visible but slow. After a week of full-day weaving, the walls had risen perhaps 2 feet. The first section of willow wall took Anders 3 days to complete, and by the time he finished, every muscle in his back and shoulders ached from the repetitive motion of bending and weaving. But when he stepped back to examine his work, he felt something close to satisfaction. The woven section was tight enough that he could barely see through it, and when he pressed his hand against the surface, it flexed inward slightly before pushing back. It was exactly what he had envisioned. The weaving pattern itself required constant attention to maintain consistency. Anders used a simple over-under technique, the same his grandmother had used, but the scale created challenges she had never faced. With basket weaving, you could hold the work in your hands and feel when the tension was right. With wall weaving, Anders had to judge by eye and by testing each section as he worked. He developed a rhythm. Select a branch from the soaking pool. Shake off excess water. Position it at the correct height. Weave it through the vertical posts. Tap it down with the mallet to compress it against the row below, then move to the next branch. Over and over, hundreds of times each day. The willow itself behaved differently depending on its thickness and the time it had spent soaking. Thicker branches provided more structural strength but were harder to weave tightly. Thinner branches wove easily but required more rows to build up height. Anders learned to alternate thick and thin rows, creating a pattern that balanced strength with weaving efficiency. As the walls rose higher, neighbors began stopping by more frequently. Their visits had a quality of morbid curiosity, like watching someone build something they were certain would fail. They examined the woven sections, pressed against them, asked questions that were really criticisms disguised as interest. "What happens when it rains?" Niels asked, running his hand over the textured surface of the willow wall. "The weave is tight enough to shed water," Anders said, "and I will pack moss between the layers for additional weatherproofing." "What happens when winter comes and the willow freezes?" another neighbor asked. "Willow flexes when frozen," Anders said. "It does not become brittle like some woods." "What happens when a bear decides to test these walls?" This from a trapper named Carl, who had lost part of his hand to a bear 3 years earlier and viewed all frontier construction through the lens of that experience. "The weave distributes force across hundreds of contact points," Anders said. "There is no single point of failure for a bear to exploit." They were not convinced, but Anders had not expected them to be. Conviction would come later if his design worked. For now, he simply continued weaving. By late April, the walls had reached 4 feet in height. The structure was beginning to look less like an experiment and more like an actual building, though unlike any building the settlement had seen before. The woven texture gave it an organic quality, as if the cabin were growing rather than being built. Anders worked alone. No one offered to help, which suited him. The weaving required a consistency of technique that would be difficult to maintain with multiple workers. Each person would weave slightly differently, creating weak points where techniques varied. As the walls rose past the halfway point, Anders encountered problems he had not anticipated during his small-scale tests. The primary issue was weight distribution. Each row of woven willow added weight to the rows below, and as the walls grew taller, the compression at the bottom increased. The lower rows began to compress more than he had expected, creating a slight bulge in the wall about 2 feet above ground level. Anders stopped weaving and spent 2 days studying the problem. The bulge was not yet structural dangerous, but if it continued to develop, it could weaken the entire wall. He realized that his weaving technique, while adequate for the first few feet, needed modification for taller construction. The solution came from thinking about how trees grew. A tree trunk was thicker at the base than at the top, providing more strength where the weight was greatest. Anders decided to apply the same principle to his weaving. He began using thicker willow branches for the lower sections and gradually transitioning to thinner branches as the walls rose. This distributed the structural load more effectively and prevented further compression bulging. He also modified his weaving pattern. Instead of a simple over-under pattern throughout, he introduced sections where he wove 2 branches together before passing them through the posts. This created a denser, stronger weave at strategic points, particularly at the corners and around the door and window openings where stress would be concentrated. The window opening required special attention. Anders had decided on a single window on the south wall, positioned high enough to provide light, but small enough to minimize heat loss. He framed the opening with horizontal willow rods woven in a reinforced pattern, creating a rigid frame within the flexible wall. The technique worked. The opening maintained its shape as the walls continued to rise around it. The door opening presented similar challenges, but on a larger scale. Anders built a frame of split logs for the door, setting it between 2 of his main vertical posts. He wove the willow walls up to the frame on both sides, creating a transition between the flexible woven walls and the rigid door frame. The connection points were critical. If the willow pulled away from the door frame, gaps would appear. Anders solved this by weaving the willow around the frame posts, wrapping each branch completely around before continuing the weaving pattern. This locked the woven wall to the frame mechanically, preventing separation. By mid-May, the walls had reached their full height of 8 feet. Anders stood inside the unfinished structure and looked up at the roof frame above him. The willow walls surrounded him, filtering the afternoon light into a soft, green glow. The space felt different from a log cabin. The woven walls seemed alive somehow, organic and breathing. He pressed his hand against the interior surface and felt the slight give and return that was the fundamental characteristic of his design. Outside, the walls looked like enormous basketwork, which, of course, they were. The willow had retained its natural color, a pale tan mixed with gray where the bark remained. The texture was unlike anything else in the settlement. The completion of the walls marked the moment when Anders's cabin became impossible to ignore. What had been an eccentric experiment in progress was now a finished structure, and it looked absolutely ridiculous by every standard of frontier architecture. The settlement had no formal gathering point, but news traveled quickly through the scattered homesteads, and within 2 days of Anders finishing his walls, he had received visits from nearly every family within 10 miles. They came to see the basket house, as it was now universally called. Some visitors were merely curious. Others came specifically to mock. A few came with genuine concern that Anders had wasted months of labor on something that could not possibly function as a dwelling. Henrik Sundquist arrived with 3 other men, all senior members of the community. They walked around the structure slowly, examining it from every angle. Henrik pressed his considerable weight against the walls in several places, testing their strength. The walls flexed inward under the pressure but did not collapse or show signs of failure. "It is certainly built," Henrik said finally, "but built for what purpose, I cannot say. This is not a cabin. This is a curiosity. It will be warmer and more weatherproof than any log cabin in the settlement," Anders said. "That is quite a claim from a man living in woven sticks," one of Henrik's companions said. The others laughed. Niels Ekstrom brought his wife and children to see what their neighbor had built. The children thought it was wonderful and asked if they could play inside the basket house. Niels's wife looked at the structure with obvious pity, then took Anders aside. "You should rebuild properly before winter," she said quietly. "This cannot possibly keep out the cold. You will freeze as surely as Elizabeth did, and then what will have been the point of all this work?" Anders thanked her for her concern, but made no promises to rebuild. The mockery took various forms. Someone left a large woven basket on Anders's doorstep with a note suggesting he was running out of space for his collection. Another person asked loudly whether Anders planned to weave a wife next, since he seemed to prefer making things from sticks rather than proper materials. A group of younger men made a habit of walking past the cabin and calling out "basket weaver" whenever they saw Anders outside. The term was not meant as a compliment. In frontier culture, basket weaving was women's work, suitable for making small household items, but not serious construction. By building his cabin from woven willow, Anders had marked himself as someone who either did not understand proper masculine frontier skills or who was too weak to execute them. Anders endured the mockery without response. He had expected it, and he knew that words would not change anyone's mind. Only performance would matter. If his cabin survived what log cabins could not, the mockery would stop. If it failed, the mockery would be justified. He focused on finishing the interior work and preparing for the true test that would come with the next winter storm. The first rain came in late May, a heavy downpour that lasted 3 days and tested every cabin in the settlement. Anders watched from inside his willow-weave structure as water streamed off the timber roof he had built using conventional methods. The test was not the roof, which he knew would hold. The test was the walls. Water ran down the exterior surface of the woven willow in sheets, and Anders walked the interior perimeter with a candle, looking for leaks. He found none. The willow-weave was tight enough that water could not penetrate directly through. It ran down the exterior surface and dripped off at ground level, exactly as rain ran down the bark of a living tree. But he had anticipated a secondary problem. Even if water did not penetrate the weave directly, it could soak into the willow itself and eventually saturate through to the interior. To prevent this, Anders had packed the spaces between woven layers with dried moss mixed with clay and pine pitch. The mixture created a hydrophobic barrier that shed moisture while still allowing the walls to breathe. After 3 days of continuous rain, the interior walls were dry to the touch. The exterior willow had darkened with moisture, but no water had penetrated through to the living space. Anders felt a cautious satisfaction. The first test was passed. The second test came in June when temperatures rose and the settlement experienced a week of intense heat. Log cabins became ovens during summer heat, the thick walls absorbing and radiating warmth until the interiors were nearly uninhabitable during afternoon hours. Anders's cabin remained noticeably cooler. The willow walls, he realized, were acting as insulation in a way solid logs could not. The thousands of small air pockets trapped within the weave pattern created thermal mass that resisted heat transfer. Warm air from outside took longer to penetrate the complex structure of the woven walls. The effect was subtle but measurable. where neighbors complained of interior temperatures that made sleep difficult, Anders's cabin remained comfortable enough that he did not need to sleep outside as many others did. Several neighbors noticed this and asked about it. Anders explained the insulating properties of the weave pattern, but he could see they remained skeptical. One fortunate result of the heat test was that it dried and hardened his moss-clay pitch mixture. The compound had cured into a resilient barrier that was no longer pliable but remained flexible enough to accommodate the natural movement of the willow. By late summer, the walls had settled into their final form. The willow had dried and hardened, losing the green flexibility of fresh-cut branches, but retaining enough give to accommodate stress without cracking. The color had faded to a silvery gray that looked almost like weathered wood. The structure had stopped looking temporary. It now looked permanent, though still unlike any other cabin in the settlement. The mockery had diminished somewhat, replaced by puzzled acceptance. Anders had built something strange, and it had not immediately collapsed or failed. That was more than some had expected. But the real test was still coming. Everyone knew it. Anders knew it. Winter would prove whether the basket house was innovation or folly. The first snow fell in early October, light flurries that dusted the ground and melted by midday. But the message was clear. Winter was coming, and with it would come the conditions that had killed Elizabeth and that would either validate or destroy everything Anders had built. He spent the autumn weeks preparing. He chinked any gaps he found between the woven willow and the timber roof frame. He built interior shelves and a sleeping platform, keeping them away from the walls to allow air circulation. He constructed a proper door from split planks, mounting it on iron hinges he had traded for at considerable cost. The door was conventional timber construction because Anders knew that some elements of building required rigid strength rather than flexible resilience. By late October, the cabin was as ready as Anders could make it. He had accumulated firewood, stocked supplies, and prepared for isolation. The settlement's population had thinned as some families moved to lower elevations for winter or returned east. Those who remained were the committed ones, people who had decided this territory was worth the hardship. The first hard freeze came on November 3rd. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero overnight, and Anders woke to find frost coating the interior of his window. He rose and checked the walls, running his hands over the interior surface. The willow was cold to the touch, but showed no signs of cracking or stress. He examined the corners where log cabins typically showed their first failures. The woven willow had no corner joints in the traditional sense. The weave pattern simply continued around the corners in a continuous spiral. There were no compression points to fail, no notches to separate. The cold intensified over the following weeks. By late November, temperatures were consistently below zero, sometimes dropping to 30 below during clear nights. Anders monitored his cabin obsessively, checking for any signs of failure. He found none. The willow walls flexed slightly when strong winds hit them, bowing inward perhaps half an inch before returning to their original position. The movement was barely perceptible, but Anders could feel it when he placed his palm flat against the interior surface during wind gusts. The cabin breathed with the wind, rather than resisting it. Log cabins were rigid. They stood firm against wind pressure, which meant the wind had to either blow past them or break through them. There was no middle option. Anders's woven walls offered a third option. They absorbed wind pressure through flex, distributed the force across thousands of individual willow branches, then returned to position when the pressure passed. It was the same principle that allowed willow baskets to survive being dropped or knocked over. Flexibility was a form of strength that rigid structures could not match. On December 8th, a winter storm moved through the region with winds strong enough to tear branches from trees. The storm hit just after sunset on December 8, 1847. Anders had spent the afternoon securing everything outside that could blow away and banking his fire to provide steady heat through the night. He knew from watching the sky that this would be the kind of storm that tested every structure in the settlement. The wind arrived first, gusting strong enough to shake the cabin. Anders sat at his table with a candle and listened to the sounds his home made under stress. The timber roof frame creaked as wind pressure tried to lift it. The door rattled against its frame despite being barred. And the walls, the woven willow walls that everyone had mocked, made a sound Anders had never heard before. They sang. It was a low humming created by wind moving through the thousands of small gaps in the weave pattern. The sound rose and fell with the wind gusts, sometimes barely audible, sometimes loud enough to drown out the storm noise outside. Anders stood and placed both hands flat against the interior wall surface. He could feel the wall moving, flexing inward when gusts hit, then pushing back out. The movement was perhaps an inch at its maximum, enough that he could measure it by watching the gap between the wall and a shelf he had deliberately mounted an inch away from the surface. The wall touched the shelf edge during the strongest gusts, then pulled away as the pressure released. In a log cabin, this kind of wind created a different set of sounds. Logs groaned as they shifted in their notches. Chinking fell out as joints compressed and released. Gaps opened between logs that had fit tightly when the cabin was built. And sometimes, when the wind was strong enough and the temperature cold enough, logs cracked with sounds like gunshots. Anders heard those sounds that night, but they came from outside his cabin, from neighboring structures. Around midnight, he heard a particularly loud crack from the direction of Nils Ekström's cabin, perhaps a quarter-mile away. Something had broken. A log splitting, most likely, or a corner joint failing under the combination of wind stress and cold. His own cabin continued its strange humming song, walls flexing and returning, hundreds of times through the night. Anders checked every section of wall he could reach, looking for signs of failure. He found none. The weaving held. Individual willow branches might be bending and stressing, but the pattern distributed that stress so effectively that no single point was overloaded. The temperature inside remained stable. His fire was adequate to keep the space livable, and more importantly, no cold air was streaming through gaps in the walls. The willow weave moved, but did not separate. The moss and clay mixture between layers compressed slightly when the walls flexed but did not crack or fall out. By dawn, the storm had passed. Anders opened his door to a landscape transformed by snow and wind damage. Branches were down everywhere. Drifts had piled against every structure. And in the gray morning light, he could see smoke rising from cabin chimneys across the settlement as people stoked their fires against the bitter cold that followed the storm. Anders pulled on his heavy coat and walked through knee-deep snow to check on his neighbors. The damage was immediately visible. Nearly every log cabin within sight distance showed new cracks or gaps. Some were minor, thin lines between logs where chinking had fallen out. Others were more serious. Nils Ekström's cabin had a split running through a corner log, a crack wide enough that Anders could see daylight through it from 50 feet away. Nils was outside working on a temporary repair when Anders arrived. He had stuffed the crack with cloth and was trying to pack moss around it, but his hands were clumsy with cold and the moss kept falling out. "The whole corner shifted," Nils said when he saw Anders. "The wind pushed from the west and something gave. Now I have this." He gestured at the crack with obvious frustration. Anders helped him pack the crack properly, using clay mixed with snow to create a paste that would hold until the weather warmed enough for proper repairs. They worked in silence for several minutes before Nils spoke again. "Your cabin? Made it through?" It was not quite an accusation, but there was something in his tone. "It did," Anders said. "Any damage?" "None that I found." Nils stopped working and looked at Anders directly. "The walls held, the willow weaving." "It flexed with the wind," Anders said, "but it did not crack or separate." Nils returned to packing the crack in his cabin. He did not say anything else, but Anders could see him thinking. They finished the repair work, and Anders moved on to check other cabins. The pattern repeated itself throughout the morning. Johann Stenberg had gaps at 3 corners where the logs had shifted. Karl the trapper had chinking blown out along an entire wall section. Henrik Sundquist's cabin had developed a crack in a roof beam that would need replacement before the next heavy snow. Everyone was making repairs. Everyone had damage of some kind. By midday, a small group had gathered near the settlement's informal center, comparing damage and discussing repairs. Anders approached, and several conversations stopped. Henrik Sundquist looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Your cabin?" "No damage," Anders said. The silence that followed was not hostile exactly, but it was not comfortable either. These men had spent months mocking Anders's basket house, and now their solid log cabins had cracked and shifted, while his woven willow walls had flexed and held. No one apologized. No one admitted they had been wrong. But the mockery stopped. That afternoon, Per Holmgren walked to Anders's cabin and stood outside for several minutes before knocking. Anders opened the door and invited him in. Per entered slowly, looking around the interior with obvious curiosity. He examined the walls, pressing his hand against them, studying how they were constructed. Per Holmgren was a quiet man, slower to speak than most in the settlement, but more thoughtful when he did. He had arrived from Sweden 2 years after Anders, settling a claim 5 miles north along the same creek system. He had never joined the mockery of Anders's cabin, but he had never defended it either. Now he stood in the center of the Willow-Weave structure, turning slowly to examine every aspect of its construction. "May I?" Per asked, gesturing toward the walls. Anders nodded. Per moved to the nearest wall section and began examining it closely, tracing the weaving pattern with his fingers, pressing against the surface to test its give, even putting his face close to study how the individual willow branches interlocked. He spent perhaps 10 minutes on this examination before speaking. "The wind last night," Per said. "I watched my cabin walls move. The logs shifted in their notches. I could hear it happening. I thought the whole structure might come apart." "But it held?" Anders said. "It held because the wind passed. But it will happen again. Next storm or the one after. Each time the logs shift, the notches compress a little more. The gaps grow wider. Eventually something gives." Per turned to face Anders. "Your walls moved too. I could see it from outside when I walked past this morning, but they moved differently. They bent and came back." "Flexibility instead of rigidity," Anders said, "like a tree bending in wind instead of breaking." Per nodded slowly. He walked to the door and examined how the woven walls connected to the solid door frame, seeing how Anders had wrapped the willow around the frame posts to create a mechanical lock. He looked at the window opening and the reinforced weaving pattern surrounding it. He spent time studying the corners, understanding that the continuous weave eliminated the compression joints that failed in log construction. "How long did this take to build?" Per asked. 3 months for the walls," Anders said. "Another month for interior work and finishing." "And the willow? Where did you harvest it?" Anders explained his selection process, the soaking pools, the weaving technique variations he had developed. Per listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as pieces of understanding fell into place. When Anders finished, Per stood quietly for another moment before speaking. "I need to rebuild my south wall before next winter," he said. "The logs there have shifted badly, and the chinking will not hold. I was planning to replace the logs using standard methods, but I am thinking now that there might be a better way." It was not quite a request for help, but the implication was clear. "The technique is not complicated," Anders said, "but it requires patience and attention to detail. The weaving must be consistent or weak points develop." "Could you show me?" Per asked. "When weather permits and you have time, I would like to understand how this works before I commit to rebuilding." Anders agreed. They arranged to meet in early spring when the ground thawed and willow cutting could begin. Per thanked him and left, but before he reached the door, he turned back. "The others will not admit they were wrong," Per said. "You know that. Henrik especially. But they saw what happened last night. They saw which cabins cracked and which did not. Some of them will come asking questions, eventually." Per returned 3 days later with paper and pencil, unusual items for a frontier trapper to carry. He had come prepared to take notes, to document what Anders was willing to teach. They sat at Anders's table while snow fell outside, and Anders explained the principles underlying his construction method. "The fundamental problem with log cabins," Anders began, "is that wood is rigid and wood moves. Logs expand when wet, contract when dry. They expand when warm, contract when cold. This movement is small, perhaps a fraction of an inch per log. But when you stack 20 logs and notch them at corners, those small movements multiply and concentrate at the joints. That is where failure happens." Per wrote this down, his handwriting careful and precise. Anders continued, explaining how woven willow eliminated rigid joints by creating a structure where thousands of individual elements could move independently while still maintaining collective integrity. He described how the weave pattern distributed stress, how the flexibility absorbed force that would crack rigid materials, how the moss and clay mixture between layers provided insulation while accommodating the natural movement of the willow. "But willow is not as strong as logs," Per said. "Individual willow branches, no, but woven together in proper pattern, willow is stronger than logs of equivalent thickness. A log will crack if you stress it beyond its breaking point. Woven willow will flex and distribute that stress across hundreds of branches. It cannot crack because there is no single piece large enough to crack." They moved outside despite the cold, and Anders showed Per sections of the exterior wall, pointing out how the weaving pattern varied at different heights, how thicker branches at the base provided more strength where weight was concentrated, how the corners were woven in continuous spirals rather than joined. Per examined everything closely, asking questions about branch selection, soaking times, weaving tension. His questions were intelligent and specific. He was not simply curious, he was planning. "How much willow would I need for a full wall replacement?" Per asked. "Your south wall? Perhaps 1,500 branches, maybe 2,000 to have extra for mistakes or breakage during weaving. And the time to harvest that much? 4 weeks if you work steadily. Another 2 weeks to process and soak them properly." Per did calculations on his paper. "So 6 weeks of preparation before I can begin actual construction. Then how long to weave?" "For a single wall, with someone experienced helping you, perhaps 3 weeks." Per folded his paper and tucked it inside his coat. "I will think on this through the winter. Come spring, if I decide to proceed, may I ask for your help with the actual weaving?" "Of course," Anders said. They shook hands, and Per departed. Anders watched him walk away through the snow and understood that something significant had just happened. Spring came late in 1848, the snow holding until mid-April. When the ground finally thawed, Per Holmgren arrived at Anders's cabin with a sled and tools. He had made his decision. They spent 2 weeks cutting willow together, working the creek bottoms and selecting branches according to the standards Anders had established. Per learned quickly, developing an eye for the right diameter and flexibility. He asked questions constantly, wanting to understand not just what to do, but why each decision mattered. The actual wall replacement began in early May. Anders helped Per dismantle the damaged south wall of his cabin, salvaging the logs that were still sound and discarding those that had cracked beyond repair. They built a temporary canvas shelter over the opening to keep weather out while they worked on the permanent replacement. The weaving process took longer than Anders had estimated because Per insisted on learning every aspect of the technique properly. He wanted to understand not just how to weave, but how to judge tension, how to identify and correct mistakes, how to handle corners and openings. Anders was patient. Teaching someone else forced him to articulate knowledge he had developed through trial and error, and in explaining his methods to Per, Anders gained a deeper understanding of his own techniques. By mid-June, Per's south wall was complete. The willow weaving matched the height and thickness of his remaining log walls, though it looked dramatically different. Per had followed Anders's methods exactly, creating a tight weave that was both flexible and strong. They tested the completed wall by pushing against it, by throwing their weight against it, by having both men press simultaneously at different points. The wall flexed slightly, but showed no signs of weakness or failure. Per stood back and examined what he had built. "It looks strange," he said. "It does," Anders agreed, "but it will outlast your log walls." Word spread through the settlement that Per Holmgren had replaced a wall using Anders's basket weaving technique. The response was mixed. Some saw it as vindication of Anders's approach. Others saw it as two eccentric Swedes engaging in shared foolishness. But unlike the previous year when Anders had built his full cabin, the mockery was muted. People remembered the winter storm and which structures had held and which had cracked. The second winter proved the durability of both Anders's cabin and Per's wall replacement. Another major storm hit in January of 1849, with winds that matched or exceeded the previous year's event. Both willow-weave structures flexed and held, while log cabins throughout the settlement developed new cracks or saw existing damage worsen. By spring of 1849, 3 more families had approached Anders about building with willow-weave or replacing damaged wall sections. He helped where he could, teaching the techniques and emphasizing the importance of proper branch selection and consistent weaving. The method was spreading, not through formal instruction or promotional effort, but through simple demonstration of superior performance. Anders had never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. He had simply adapted an old technique to solve a specific problem, but the adaptation was proving more valuable than even he had anticipated. By 1852, willow-weave construction had become common enough among Swedish and Norwegian settlers in the Minnesota Territory that travelers began noting it in letters and journals. The technique had spread beyond Anders's immediate settlement, carried by families who moved to new claims, or by trappers who spent winters in different locations and observed what worked. Anders himself had helped build or advise on perhaps a dozen structures by that point, but he had stopped counting. What mattered was not the number, but the fact that the technique was sustaining itself without his constant involvement. New builders were learning from those he had taught, and the knowledge was propagating organically through the Scandinavian immigrant community. The method had evolved slightly as others adapted it to their specific needs and available materials. Some builders used a tighter weave pattern than Anders had developed, creating walls that were denser but took longer to construct. Others experimented with different waterproofing compounds, mixing pine tar with clay, or using rendered animal fat to make the moss packing more weather-resistant. A few builders had tried combining willow weave with partial log construction, using solid logs for corners and woven willow for the wall sections between. Anders observed these variations with interest but did not insist on his original methods. The fundamental principle remained the same regardless of specific execution. Flexible materials woven in distributed patterns would always outperform rigid materials joined at compression points when subjected to stress from temperature changes and wind. By 1853, Anders noticed that people had stopped calling it his technique or his method. It was simply how some people built cabins now, one option among several, chosen by those who valued durability and weather resistance over speed of construction. He was rarely given credit for developing the approach, and he found he did not mind. The innovation had taken on a life independent of its creator, which seemed appropriate for something as practical and unassuming as a better way to build walls. Henrik Sundquist never acknowledged that Anders had been right about willow-weave construction. The old man maintained until his death in 1855 that proper cabins were built from logs and that basket weaving, however clever, was not serious architecture. But Anders noticed that Henrik stopped mocking those who built with willow, and that was acknowledgement enough. Niels Ekstrom eventually rebuilt his entire cabin using willow-weave walls after a particularly harsh winter in 1854 caused so much damage to his log structure that repair was no longer practical. He asked Anders for advice during the planning stage, but hired Per Holmgren to help with the actual construction. The choice made sense. Per had become more practiced at the technique than Anders, having built or repaired more structures in recent years. When Niels's new cabin was complete, he stopped by Anders's place with a bottle of whiskey. They drank together without discussing the past or acknowledging how their relationship had changed. Some things did not need to be said aloud. The true legacy of Anders's innovation was not in the cabins themselves, but in the principle they demonstrated. Frontier settlers learned that traditional methods were not automatically the best methods. Sometimes an outsider perspective, combined with old knowledge from a different context, could solve problems that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. Anders Lindqvist died on March 14, 1871, at age 56. He had remarried in 1853 to a widow named Karen, who brought 2 children from her previous marriage. They had 1 child together, a daughter named Elizabeth, after his first wife. By the time of his death, Anders had lived longer in his willow-weave cabin than he had lived in any other dwelling in his life. The cabin had required minimal maintenance over its 24 years. Anders had repaired the roof twice and replaced the door once when the original hinges finally rusted through. But the willow walls had needed almost nothing. They had darkened with age to a deep gray, and the weaving had compressed slightly over the decades, but the structure remained sound. He died in his sleep during an early spring night when temperatures dropped unexpectedly. Karen found him in the morning, peaceful in the bed he had built when he first completed the cabin. They buried him on the same hillside where Elizabeth rested, overlooking the creek where he had harvested thousands of willow branches a quarter-century earlier. The funeral was well attended. Anders had lived quietly, but he was respected. Many of the people present lived in willow-weave cabins or had family members who did. No one gave speeches about Anders's innovation or his contribution. To frontier architecture, the recognition was simpler and more profound. They stood in the cold and acknowledged a man who had solved a problem that saved lives, including some of their own. Karen and her children continued living in the cabin for 3 more years before selling the property and moving to St. Paul, where the children could attend proper school. The new owner was a young Norwegian immigrant who recognized the quality of the construction and maintained it carefully. The cabin changed hands twice more over the following decades, each time finding owners who appreciated its unusual design and superior weatherproofing. By 1890, most of the original log cabins from the settlement's early years had been replaced or rebuilt multiple times. Logs rotted, joints failed, and structures simply wore out under the stress of repeated freeze-thaw cycles and constant maintenance demands. But Anders's willow-weave cabin still stood, weathered but solid. Its walls still flexible enough to move with the wind, still tight enough to shed rain, still warm enough to survive the coldest Minnesota winters. Travelers occasionally remarked on the strange woven cabin visible from the main trail. Some stopped to ask about its construction. The owners explained what they knew, which was usually incomplete. The story of Anders Lindqvist and why he had built the way he did had faded into partial legend, details lost or confused. But the cabin itself remained, physical evidence of what determination and unconventional thinking could accomplish. In 1903, a surveyor mapping Old Homestead claims measured and photographed Anders's cabin as an example of immigrant frontier construction. The photograph showed a structure that had stood for 56 years, longer than most of its builders' contemporaries were alive. The walls were still intact, still woven tight, still doing exactly what Anders had intended. The last known occupant left the cabin in 1908. After that it stood empty, slowly deteriorating as weather and neglect took their inevitable toll.